I've often wondered if there's a special kind of training program for HOA presidents, one that specifically teaches them how to cultivate an aura of self-importance so dense it could bend light. Because let me tell you, the one I dealt with, a woman we'll call President Priscilla, was a masterclass in petty tyranny. She tried to fine me, repeatedly, for camping beside a lake she claimed was HOA common property. The kicker? It wasn't theirs. Not even close. So, what's a reasonable, mild-mannered environmental consultant with a penchant for quiet weekends by the water to do when faced with such egregious overreach? Well, naturally, I bought the entire lake and all the surrounding acreage, and then, oh boy, then I made some new rules of my own. Stick around, because this story is, frankly, certifiably nuts, and you're going to want to hear how it all went down. Before we dive in, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these tales of suburban warfare travel. This whole saga started, as these things often do, quite innocently. I'd bought my house in the Whispering Pines subdivision a couple of years prior. It was on the edge of the development, bordering a lovely stretch of undeveloped woodland that sloped down to a small, serene body of water known locally as Lost Man's Lake. It wasn't a grand lake, more of a large pond, really, but it was peaceful, teeming with wildlife, and, crucially, not actually part of Whispering Pines, according to the plat maps I'd reviewed before purchasing. My property line was a good 50 feet from the high water mark, separated by a strip of what appeared to be unmanaged, privately owned woodland. I'm an environmental consultant by trade, specializing in land use and ecological assessments, so poring over surveys, deeds, and GIS data is practically a hobby. I'd noted this buffer zone specifically, relieved that the HOA's tendrils didn't extend to the water itself. My first summer there, I'd take my kayak down, launch it from a little natural clearing, and spend hours paddling, fishing, or just drifting. Occasionally, I'd camp overnight. Nothing elaborate. A small tent, a little camp stove for coffee, strictly leave, no trace. I treasured those moments of solitude. The HOA, presided over by the aforementioned President Priscilla, was mostly a distant hum of busybody activity. Notices about lawn length, the approved shades of beige for mailbox posts, the seasonal wreath debacle of 22. Priscilla herself was a caricature. Mid-50s, hair sculpted into a peroxide blonde helmet that defied hurricane, force winds, always clad in aggressively bright athleisure wear that looked like it had never seen a bead of sweat, and driving a gleaming white SUV the size of a small rhino, usually well above the posted speed limit. Her pronouncements at the rare community meetings I attended were delivered with the unwavering conviction of a Roman emperor addressing the Senate, if the Senate were mostly concerned with petunias and parking violations. I mostly kept my head down. My lawn was neat, my mailbox post was regulation beige, and my seasonal wreaths were, I hoped, deeply uncontroversial. The trouble began on a beautiful Saturday morning in early fall. I'd set up my small tent the previous evening in my usual spot by Lost Man's Lake, well away from any HOA-maintained areas. On that strip of woodland I believed to be privately owned and unassociated with Whispering Pines. I was enjoying a cup of coffee, watching the mist rise off the water, when I saw her, Priscilla, marching down the faint trail from the edge of the development, followed by her perpetually nervous-looking vice president, a thin man named Gerald, who always seemed to be apologizing for something with his entire posture. Priscilla stopped a few yards from my campsite, hands on her hips, her face a mask of affronted authority. "Mr. Henderson," she boomed, her voice echoing slightly across the water, making a family of ducks take flight. "What, precisely, do you think you're doing?" I remained seated on my camp chair, coffee cup in hand. "Good morning, Priscilla." "Gerald, I'm enjoying a cup of coffee. And the view. It's quite lovely today, isn't it?" Priscilla's eyes narrowed. "You are on HOA common property, Mr. Henderson, and you have erected an unauthorized structure. Furthermore, overnight camping is strictly prohibited by Covenant 7, subsection B, paragraph 4. She recited this like it was scripture. "Actually, Priscilla," I said, keeping my tone mild. I'm fairly certain this land isn't part of the HOA common area. My property line is back there. I gestured vaguely towards my house, and the HOA boundary, according to the official plat map, ends well before this point. Her face flushed a rather alarming shade of puce, clashing spectacularly with her neon pink jacket. Nonsense. This lake, and the access to it, is for the enjoyment of all Whispering Pines residents, under HOA stewardship. You can't just pitch a tent here like some sort of vagrant. Gerald winced beside her. The term vagrant seemed a bit much for a homeowner in a two-man tent with a high-end coffee press. I can assure you, I said, I'm not a vagrant, and I've reviewed the documents. This area isn't designated as HOA common land. I believe it's privately held. Priscilla scoffed, a sound like air escaping a punctured inflatable flamingo. We have maintained this access path for years. We host the annual Whispering Pines Flotilla Festival right here. Of course it's ours. You'll be receiving a formal violation notice and a fine for the unauthorized structure, and another for illegal camping. $200 each, payable within 14 days. She then turned on her heel, nearly tripping Gerald, and marched back up the path, muttering about flagrant disregard and making an example. Gerald offered me a brief, apologetic shrug before scurrying after her. I sighed, the peace of the morning thoroughly shattered. $200 each, $400 for enjoying a quiet night by a lake I was 99% sure they didn't own. This wasn't just about money. It was about the sheer, unadulterated audacity. The Whispering Pines Flotilla Festival, by the way, consisted of 3 families with inflatable rafts racing 10 yards from the shore, an event Priscilla lorded over like the admiral of a grand fleet. The maintained path was a deer trail that the HOA had once paid a kid to clear with a weed whacker about 5 years ago. This, I realized, was not something I could just let slide. This was a declaration of suburban war, and President Priscilla had severely underestimated her opponent. She thought she was dealing with just another resident she could browbeat into submission. She had no idea she was poking a bear who not only knew how to read maps but also had the patience and resources to see a fight through to its, shall we say, logical conclusion. The fine notice arrived 3 days later, on official-looking HOA letterhead, complete with blurry photos of my tent taken from a distance, presumably by a skulking Gerald. It cited the aforementioned covenants and demanded prompt payment to avoid further penalties, including, but not limited to, late fees, legal costs, and a public shaming at the next HOA meeting. Okay, it didn't say the last part, but it was heavily implied. I looked at the notice, then out my window towards the shimmering expanse of Lost Man's Lake. A small smile played on my lips. Oh, Priscilla, I thought, you have no idea what you've just started. The first step, of course, was to confirm with absolute certainty what I already strongly suspected, the true ownership status of that patch of woodland and the lake itself. My initial pre-purchase research had been for my own due diligence, but now, this was for ammunition. I pulled up the county's Geographic Information System, the GIS portal. It's a fantastic tool, layers upon layers of property data, zoning information, topographical maps, aerial imagery, all publicly accessible if you know where to look. I located my own parcel, then the adjacent ones that constituted the Whispering Pines HOA. The lines were clear, digitally delineated with precision. And just as I remembered, the HOA's collective boundary stopped short of the lake by a significant margin. The land where I camped, the surrounding woods, and the entirety of Lost Man's Lake itself were designated as a separate, distinct parcel, under a different ownership entry entirely. It wasn't unowned or county land or state land. It was listed under Blackwood Creek Properties LLC. I made a note of the parcel identification number. The next morning, I took a drive to the county courthouse, specifically the Recorder of Deeds office. Mrs. Henderson, a delightful woman with spectacles perched on her nose and a encyclopedic knowledge of local land history, had helped me before when I was researching some wetland delineation for a client. Mr. Henderson, back again? she chirped as I approached the counter. What mystery are we unraveling today? Buried treasure? A long-lost heir? I chuckled. Something a little less romantic, I'm afraid, Mrs. Henderson. Just trying to confirm the ownership of a particular parcel. Number 47 B/221 Alpha. She typed expertly into her computer, her brow furrowed in concentration. Ah, yes. Lost Man's Lake and the surrounding 27 acres. Interesting. She printed out the current deed and the historical chain of title. Blackwood Creek Properties, LLC. She confirmed. Registered agent is a law firm downtown. Looks like they've owned it since 1978. Acquired it from the estate of an old timber family, the McAllisters. And the Whispering Pines HOA? I asked. Do they have any recorded easements, rights of way, leases, anything at all pertaining to this parcel? Mrs. Henderson clicked a few more times. Nothing recorded, Miss Henderson. No easements, no leases, no liens from the HOA. As far as the county records are concerned, Blackwood Creek Properties, LLC has sole, unencumbered title to that land. Whispering Pines has no legal standing there whatsoever. She handed me the printouts. Of course, she added, lowering her voice slightly. That doesn't always stop an ambitious hoe from acting like they own something, does it? I grinned. You've hit the nail on the head, Mrs. Henderson. Thank you, you've been an immense help. Armed with official county documents, my next step was to craft a polite but firm response to President Priscilla's violation notice. I scanned the deed information and a snippet of the county GIS map clearly showing the parcel lines, then composed a letter. In it, I respectfully pointed out that the location of my campsite was, according to official county records, on parcel 47 B/221 Alpha, owned by Blackwood Creek Properties LLC, and not on HOA common land. Therefore, HOA Covenants 7b/4 did not apply, and the fines were invalid. I included copies of the relevant documents and suggested that the HOA board might want to consult the official plat maps of the subdivision to clarify the boundaries of their jurisdiction. I sent it via certified mail, return receipt requested, because I had a feeling Priscilla wasn't the type to admit a mistake gracefully or at all. I also paid a visit to my friend and neighbor Tom, who lived a few doors down. Tom was a retired engineer, quiet and observant, and had lived in Whispering Pines since it was first developed. He'd seen a parade of HOA presidents come and go. Priscilla's on the warpath about the lake again, huh? He said, shaking his head as I recounted the incident over coffee in his kitchen. She does this every few years, tries to assert control over it. Thinks it makes the HOA look more prestigious if they can claim lakefront access. Old man Hemlock, who owned the parcel before Blackwood Creek Properties, nominally bought it, though I suspect Blackwood is just a holding company for the Hemlock descendants, used to come down once a year and run her off. He'd wave his deed in her face and threaten to call the sheriff. Haven't seen anyone from Blackwood in ages, though. This was interesting. So, there was a history of this overreach, and a history of it being challenged. She actually fined me $400, I said. Tom whistled. She's getting bolder. Or more desperate. The HOA finances aren't exactly stellar, from what I hear. They overspent on that new grand entrance sign that looks like something out of a low-budget casino. I filed that nugget of information away. An HOA with financial woes might be more inclined to levy spurious fines. So, what are you going to do? Tom asked. Sent them a letter with the proof, I said. We'll see how she responds. But, Tom, this has got me thinking. If Blackwood Creek Properties isn't actively managing that land, and Priscilla keeps trying to encroach, maybe there's another way to solve this permanently. Tom raised an eyebrow. Oh? You've got that look in your eye, Henderson. The one you get before you launch into some meticulously researched project that makes everyone else's head spin. I just smiled. The seeds of a much grander plan were beginning to sprout. Priscilla had wanted control of the lake. She was about to find out what happens when you try to take something that isn't yours from someone who knows how to play the long game. The return receipt for my certified letter came back signed by Gerald predictably. Then, silence. A week passed. 2 weeks. The 14-day deadline for paying the fine came and went. I half expected another thundering missive from Priscilla, or perhaps a summons to an HOA tribunal. Instead, nothing. It was an unnerving quiet. Too quiet. I knew Priscilla. She wasn't the type to simply admit she was wrong and drop the matter, especially not after I'd so thoroughly and publicly, well, to her and Gerald, debunked her authority. Her ego wouldn't allow it. My guess was she was either fuming and plotting, or, more likely, consulting the HOA's lawyer, a fellow named Marcus Thorne, whose primary qualifications seemed to be his ability to write threatening letters on expensive letterhead without actually understanding the underlying legal principles. I decided it was time to do a little more digging into Blackwood Creek Properties LLC. An LLC can be a bit of an opaque entity, but the registered agent, the law firm Mrs. Properties LLC, Henderson had mentioned, was a public record. I looked them up. Dewey Cheatham Howe, a small, rather old-fashioned firm in a slightly faded downtown office building. It had the air of a place that handled wills and estates for families who'd been wealthy for generations but weren't flashy about it. This squared with Tom's information about the Hemlock family. My professional background often involved identifying landowners for environmental impact statements or remediation projects, so I had a few tricks up my sleeve for peeling back the layers of corporate ownership. Sometimes it led to a major corporation, sometimes to a family trust, sometimes to a single individual. Using a few online databases and a bit of cross-referencing, I managed to trace Blackwood Creek Properties LLC not to a large conglomerate, but to a single contact person listed in some older, obscure state environmental permit filings related to timber harvesting on other, unrelated parcels they'd once owned decades ago. The name was Alistair Hemlock. A quick search for Alistair Hemlock revealed an address in a quiet, affluent suburb several counties away, and a phone number. This was promising. He was likely an heir of the original timber family. The 27 acres of Lost Man's Lake was probably a forgotten remnant of a much larger portfolio, perhaps overlooked or considered too small to bother with active management. This often happens with legacy landholdings. People inherit property, pay the minimal property taxes on it, year after year out of habit or because it's bundled with other assets, but have no real connection to it or plans for it. This parcel, with its pesky HOA neighbor, might even be considered a nuisance by its current owner. I debated my next move. I could simply wait for Priscilla's next salvo, or I could be proactive. The thought that had been percolating since my conversation with Tom began to solidify into a concrete idea. What if I could just buy it? The whole parcel, the lake, the woods, everything. It would solve the Priscilla problem permanently. No more arguments about where the HOA's authority began or ended. It would be my land, period. Plus, selfishly, I loved that little lake. The thought of owning it, of being its steward, of ensuring it remained a quiet, natural sanctuary, was incredibly appealing. It was a bold idea, potentially expensive, but the satisfaction? Priceless. I decided to make the call. I rehearsed what I would say. I didn't want to sound like a developer looking to pave it over, nor did I want to sound like a crank complaining about the local HOA, at least not initially. I wanted to sound like a responsible neighbor with a genuine interest in the property. I dialed the number for Alistair Hemlock. It rang 3 times. Then an elderly, slightly reedy voice answered. "Hello? Mr. Alistair Hemlock?" I asked. "Speaking. Who is this?" "Good afternoon, Mr. Hemlock. My name is James Henderson. I'm a resident of the Whispering Pines subdivision, which, as you may know, abuts a 27-acre parcel your LLC, Blackwood Creek Properties, owns, the one that includes Lost Man's Lake." There was a pause. Lost Man's Lake? Yes, I believe I recall that one. A small piece, isn't it? Haven't thought about it in years. What can I do for you, Mr. Henderson? His tone wasn't unfriendly, just distant, like someone trying to remember a half-forgotten dream. "Well, Mr. Hemlock," I began, "I live adjacent to it, and I've come to appreciate its natural beauty very much. I was wondering if Blackwood Creek Properties had any long-term plans for the parcel, or if, perhaps, you might ever consider selling it. Another pause. Longer this time. I could hear the faint ticking of a clock in the background. Selling it? He mused. Truth be told, Mr. Henderson, it's mostly just a line item on the property tax bill each year. My father acquired it decades ago, part of a larger timber tract. This bit was too swampy around the edges for good logging, so it just sat. We've sold off most of the other holdings. This one, well, it's a bit of an orphan. Why do you ask? Are you a developer? No, sir, not at all, I said quickly. I'm an environmental consultant. My interest is primarily in preserving its current state. It's a lovely natural area. And to be perfectly frank, the local HOA sometimes gets a bit ambitious in assuming it has some jurisdiction over it, which I imagine could be a nuisance if one were trying to manage it from afar. A dry chuckle came down the line. Ah, an ambitious HOA, you say? Yes, I believe my father had a few run-ins with them back in the day. Called them the Busybody Brigade. So, you're not looking to put up condos or a shopping mall? Absolutely not, I affirmed. My primary motivation would be to ensure it remains undeveloped and to have clear, undisputed private ownership to prevent any further confusion with the HOA. And of course, for my own quiet enjoyment. Mr. Hemlock was silent for a moment. You know, Mr. Henderson, he said finally, my children have no interest in these small leftover parcels. It's probably time we divested ourselves of it fully. If you were to make a reasonable offer, I'd be inclined to present it to the other family members who technically share ownership through the LLC. We're not looking to make a fortune on it. We'd be more interested in a quick, clean sale to someone who appreciates the land for what it is. My heart did a little leap. This was going better than I could have hoped. I'd be very interested in discussing a reasonable offer, Mr. Hemlock, I said, trying to keep the excitement out of my voice. Perhaps you have a figure in mind, or I could have an appraisal done. An appraisal might be a good idea just for form's sake, he said. Get a fair market value, nothing too elaborate. Then send us a proposal. I'll be honest, if it covers the back taxes we've likely accrued some liability on and gives us a little something for our trouble, we'd probably say yes. It's more of a headache than an asset at this point, especially if that HOA is still stirring the pot. We talked for a few more minutes. He seemed like a decent, pragmatic old gentleman, tired of dealing with the remnants of his family's once vast business. He gave me the contact information for the LLC's lawyer, the one at Dewey, Cheatham, Howe, and said to direct any formal offer through them. As I hung up, I felt a surge of adrenaline. This was really happening. I was going to buy a lake. The first thing I did was call a reputable local appraiser who specialized in undeveloped land. I explained the situation, emphasizing I needed a fair market valuation, not an inflated one. He said he could get it done within a week. Next, I reviewed my finances. Buying 27 acres, even if it was somewhat neglected land, wasn't going to be cheap. But I had some investments I could liquidate, and my mortgage was manageable. This wasn't just an impulse buy. It was an investment in my peace of mind, a permanent solution to a recurring annoyance, and, honestly, the ultimate, albeit expensive, form of pro-revenge. Priscilla wanted to control the lake. I was going to own it. The appraiser came back with a figure that was, thankfully, within the realm of possibility. It wasn't insignificant, but it wasn't astronomical either. The land's limited development potential due to wetlands and access issues kept the price reasonable for its acreage. I drafted a formal offer letter, addressing it to Blackwood Creek Properties LLC, care of Dewey, Cheatham, Howe. My offer was slightly above the appraised value, just enough to make it attractive for a quick, hassle-free sale, and I stated my intention for a cash purchase with a swift closing. I sent it off, again via certified mail, and then the waiting began. This waiting was different from the silence from Priscilla. This was an eager anticipation. Meanwhile, life in Whispering Pines continued. I received another letter from the HOA. This one wasn't from Priscilla directly, but from Marcus Thorne, the HOA attorney. It was a masterpiece of bluster and veiled threats. It acknowledged my letter but dismissed my claims about the property boundary as unsubstantiated and self-serving. It stated that the HOA had a long-standing prescriptive easement over the lake access due to their continuous and notorious maintenance and use of the pathway and lakeshore for community events like the annual Flotilla Festival. Therefore, my camping was still a violation. The fine stood, and if I didn't pay up, they would explore all available legal remedies, including, but not limited to, placing a lien on my property. A prescriptive easement? That was a bold claim. To establish one, they'd need to prove continuous, open, notorious, and hostile use for a statutory period, usually many years, varying by state, without the owner's permission. Given Alistair Hemlock's father used to run them off, and the maintenance was sporadic at best, I doubted they could meet that high bar. But it showed Priscilla wasn't backing down. She was doubling down, bringing in the legal muscle, however incompetent. I chuckled. A lien on my property for camping on land they didn't own and were now trying to claim via a dubious prescriptive easement? This was getting good. I decided not to respond to Thorne's letter immediately. Why engage in a pointless legal debate when a much bigger chess move was in play? Let them think they were winning the skirmish. I was focused on winning the war. A week later, I received a call from Mr. Hemlock's lawyer. Mr. Henderson. A dry, precise voice said, "This is Arthur Grumbles from Dewey, Cheatham, Howe. We represent Blackwood Creek Properties, LLC. We've received your offer for parcel 47B/221 Alpha." My breath caught. Here it was. "Yes, Mr. Grumbles," I said, trying to sound calm and professional. "Mr. Hemlock and the other members of the LLC have reviewed your offer," he continued, his voice betraying no emotion. "They find it acceptable." I nearly dropped the phone. Acceptable? They'd accepted my offer. "They appreciate your desire for a quick cash closing and your stated intent to preserve the land. We can prepare a purchase agreement and aim to close within 30 days, if that works for you." 30 days is perfect, Mr. Grumbles," I managed, a huge grin spreading across my face. "Excellent. I'll have the agreement drafted and sent over to you for review by the end of the week. You'll want your own attorney to look it over, of course." "Of course," I said, already mentally running through a list of real estate lawyers I knew. The next few weeks were a flurry of activity, but a happy, purposeful flurry. I engaged a sharp real estate attorney, Sarah Chen, who reviewed the purchase agreement meticulously. It was straightforward, as Mr. Grumbles had promised. We arranged for title insurance, a survey update, just to be absolutely sure of the boundaries I was acquiring, and set a closing date. I liquidated some stocks, moved funds around, and tried to act nonchalant whenever I saw Priscilla patrolling the neighborhood in her Rhino SUV, her expression one of perpetual disapproval. She had no idea. The survey crew went out, very discreetly. They confirmed the boundaries precisely as shown on the county GIS and the old plat maps. 27 pristine acres, including the entirety of Lost Man's Lake, were about to be mine. The day of the closing arrived. I met Sarah at the title company's office. Mr. Grumbles was there, looking exactly as his name suggested. A bit rumpled, a bit dusty, but with shrewd eyes. The paperwork was voluminous, but it all boiled down to one simple fact. In exchange for a certified check, Blackwood Creek Properties, LLC, was transferring all rights, title, and interest in parcel 47B/221 Alpha to James Henderson. I signed my name what felt like 100 times. Then, Mr. Grumbles slid a freshly executed deed across the table. "Congratulations, Mr. Henderson," he said, with the faintest hint of a smile. "You own a lake." I picked up the deed, the official document, tangible proof of ownership. It felt surprisingly heavy, not just in paperweight, but in significance. I owned a lake, and Priscilla had no idea. Sarah and I shook hands with Mr. Grumbles, and then we were done. She said she'd handle the recording of the deed at the courthouse immediately. Within a few hours, it would be official public record. Walking out of the title company, deed in hand, or rather, a copy, As Sarah was filing the original, I felt an almost giddy sense of triumph. It was an expensive way to deal with an HOA bully, no doubt about it. Some might call it excessive. I called it a permanent solution. That evening, I didn't go down to the lake. Not yet. I wanted the deed to be officially recorded first. I wanted everything to be perfectly, unimpeachably in place before I made my next move. Instead, I sat on my porch, looking out towards the trees that fringed my new property, and savored the moment. Priscilla and her lawyer, Marcus Thorne, were probably still congratulating themselves on their threatening letter, thinking they had me on the ropes over a ridiculous $400 fine. They were playing checkers, bless their hearts. I was playing multi-dimensional chess, and I'd just executed a checkmate they hadn't even seen coming. The next morning, Sarah called to confirm. The deed was recorded. Parcel 47B/221 Alpha was now officially, publicly, and indisputably mine. It was time. I had a few things I'd ordered online in anticipation of this day. The first was a set of professionally made, private property, no trespassing signs. The second, a larger, custom-made sign that I was particularly proud of. I spent the morning installing them. The private property signs went up at regular intervals, along the entire boundary line where my new property met the HOA common areas and the road frontage it had on a small, unpaved county lane on its far side. They were clear, polite, but unambiguous. Then, I took the larger sign down to the main access point from Whispering Pines, the very path Priscilla had claimed the HOA maintained. It was a sturdy, weather-proofed wooden sign, elegantly routed. It read, Lost Man's Lake, Henderson Nature Preserve, private property, access by invitation only, all HOA prescriptive easement, claims preemptively denied. Yes, Priscilla, this means you. Okay, I admit, the last parenthetical part was perhaps a touch juvenile. But oh, it felt good. I hammered it firmly into the ground. Then, just for good measure, I unfolded my camp chair, set up my little stove, and started making a celebratory cup of coffee, right there by my new sign, on my new land. I didn't have to wait long. It was a Saturday, prime Priscilla patrolling time. Sure enough, within the hour, the white Rhino SUV came trundling down the HOA path as far as it could go, stopping abruptly when Priscilla spotted my new signage. She emerged from the vehicle, her face a thundercloud. Gerald, looking even more miserable than usual, trailed behind her. Henderson! She shrieked, her voice cracking with indignation. What is the meaning of this? You can't put these signs up. This is HOA property. We have a prescriptive easement. Our lawyer told you. She was practically vibrating with rage. Her eyes fell on the custom sign, and she read it. Her jaw, already tight, somehow managed to clench even further. The reference to her name seemed to particularly incense her. This is an outrage, an affront. You are in direct violation of everything. I sipped my coffee calmly. Good morning, Priscilla. Gerald, lovely day, isn't it? To answer your question, this is my property, all 27 acres of it. Bought and paid for. The deed was recorded yesterday morning at the county courthouse. Parcel 47B/221 Alpha, now proudly owned by James Henderson. So, you see, your prescriptive easement claim, which was dubious to begin with, is now entirely moot, as any such prior hostile use is extinguished by the change in ownership to someone who is most definitely not granting permission. In fact, I am explicitly denying any and all access to members of the Whispering Pines HOA board acting in their official capacity, and indeed to anyone who isn't personally invited by me. I gave her my most pleasant smile. Priscilla stared at me, then at the sign, then back at me. Her mouth opened and closed a few times, like a beached fish. Gerald looked like he wanted the earth to swallow him whole. You bought it? She finally stammered, disbelief warring with fury in her eyes. The whole thing? The lake? The whole kit and caboodle, I confirmed cheerfully. Lake, trees, squirrels, the works. It's all mine. Which means, unfortunately, that your flotilla festival will need to find a new venue, unless you'd like to submit a formal rental application, which, I must warn you, will be subject to rather stringent environmental impact assessments and a hefty fee. The color drained from Priscilla's face, then rushed back in a tide of crimson. You can't do this. The community, the residents, they have a right to access this lake. Actually, they don't, I corrected gently. They never did, not legally. Your HOA just pretended they did. And now I, the actual bona fide, deed-holding owner, am saying this is private property. Trespassers will be prosecuted. And just so we're clear, that includes HOA presidents who ignore clearly posted signage. I gestured towards my new signs. Gerald was now actively trying to edge behind Priscilla, as if using her as a human shield. Priscilla, for perhaps the first time since I'd known her, seemed genuinely speechless. She sputtered, pointed a trembling finger at me, then at the sign, then back at me. Words failed her. Finally, she let out a strangled yelp of frustration, spun on her heel, a maneuver she was getting quite good at, and stomped back to her SUV, slamming the door so hard I thought the window might shatter. Gerald threw me a look that was equal parts terror and, I thought, a tiny glimmer of grudging admiration, before scurrying after her. The Rhino SUV reversed at speed, spewing gravel, and disappeared up the path. I took another sip of coffee. It was, without a doubt, the most delicious cup of coffee I had ever tasted. The quiet that descended over Lost Man's Lake was profound, broken only by the chirping of birds and the gentle lapping of water against the shore. My shore. The fallout was, as they say, spectacular. News of my acquisition and the subsequent banning of HOA official business on my lake spread through Whispering Pines like wildfire. I hadn't intended for the parenthetical on the sign to become legendary, but it did. Apparently, several neighbors had witnessed Priscilla's meltdown from a discreet distance and recounted it with great relish. For the next few days, I saw a lot of curious dog walkers and joggers taking slightly longer routes that passed by the edge of my new property, peering at the signs, some with amusement, others with what looked like disapproval. The HOA board, predictably, went into emergency session. I wasn't privy to the details, of course, but the rumors were juicy. Marcus Thorne, the HOA lawyer, was apparently summoned and subjected to a rather intense grilling about how he'd missed the fact that the land was for sale, or how his brilliant, prescriptive easement strategy had been so utterly torpedoed. Thorne, in turn, apparently blamed Priscilla for providing him with inaccurate information and for her aggressive and legally untenable posturing. The HOA's next newsletter, which usually focused on lawn care tips and reminders about trash can etiquette, was conspicuously silent on the matter of Lost Man's Lake. The annual Flotilla Festival was quietly canceled, citing unforeseen logistical challenges. Priscilla herself became a much rarer sight. Her Rhino SUV was no longer a constant presence, patrolling the streets. When she was seen, she looked deflated. Her peroxide helmet seemed to droop a little, her neon athleisure wear less vibrant. The aura of absolute authority had been visibly punctured. There were, of course, some grumblers. A few die-hard Priscilla loyalists, or perhaps just residents who genuinely believed the HOA had some divine right to the lake, muttered about my selfishness and anti-community actions. One particularly aggrieved individual, a crony of Priscilla's named Agnes, who was notorious for reporting people for having bird feeders that attracted the wrong kind of birds, tried to accost me while I was getting my mail. "You had no right," she declared, her voice trembling with indignation. "That lake belongs to all of us." "Actually, Agnes," I said calmly, holding up a metaphorical copy of my deed, "it belongs to me. Check the county records, public information." She huffed and puffed but eventually retreated, muttering about new money and destroying traditions. The tradition, as far as I could tell, was Priscilla bullying people and the HOA overreaching its authority. But for every grumbler, there were 2 or 3 residents who privately, and sometimes publicly, expressed their support, or at least their amusement. Tom, my engineer neighbor, was particularly delighted. "Best $400 fine you never paid, eh, Henderson?" He chuckled, slapping me on the back. "You've done this community a service, whether they all realize it or not." Priscilla needed to be taken down a peg, or 10. Several other neighbors stopped by to thank me, sharing their own stories of petty run-ins with Priscilla and the board. It turned out I wasn't the only one who had chafed under her reign. The fines against me were, naturally, dropped. I received a curt one-sentence letter from Marcus Thorne, stating that, due to a re-evaluation of the property boundaries, the violation notices were rescinded. No apology, of course. That would have been too much to ask. I framed that letter and hung it in my office, right next to a beautiful panoramic photo I took of Lost Man's Lake from my favorite camping spot, now my permanent private camping spot. As for the lake itself, it thrived. I spent my weekends clearing out some of the actual trash that had accumulated over the years: plastic bottles, old tires, things the HOA's maintenance had never touched, improving the small trail system for my own use, and just enjoying the peace. I put up a few birdhouses and bat boxes. I even consulted with a local wildlife biologist about how to best enhance the habitat for native species. It became my sanctuary. I wasn't entirely a hermit about it, though. I let Tom fish there whenever he wanted. I invited a few other friendly neighbors for small, quiet picnics. I even hosted a nature photography walk for a local elementary school class, with strict rules about respecting the environment. The point was, it was my land, and I could choose who to share it with, and on what terms. The real kicker came about 6 months later, at the HOA's annual meeting. Priscilla, looking subdued and considerably less imperious, did not run for re-election as president. In fact, she didn't even run for a board position. The new HOA president was a mild-mannered accountant named Susan, who seemed more interested in balancing the budget and ensuring the sprinklers worked than in territorial conquest. The whole tone of the HOA shifted. It became less about power trips and more about actual community management. The reign of Priscilla was well and truly over. Sometimes, when I'm sitting by the lake in the early morning, coffee in hand, watching the mist rise, I think about the absurdity of it all. How a ridiculous, trumped-up fine for camping led to me owning 27 acres of beautiful wilderness. It was an extreme response, yes, but it was also an effective one. It wasn't just about revenge, though I'll admit the satisfaction of seeing Priscilla's face when she read that sign was a significant bonus. It was about standing up to a bully, about defending my rights, and ultimately about protecting a little piece of nature that was being used as a pawn in someone's ego trip. And you know what? I'd do it all again. So, what's the craziest HOA story you've ever heard? Or better yet, what's the most satisfying way you've ever seen an overzealous HOA president get their comeuppance? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this little tale of aquatic acquisition and petty tyrant takedown.